Bala Menon is a lead urban specialist in the South Asia region. His main professional focus is decentralization, intergovernmental fiscal relations, and municipal governance and finance. He has also worked extensively on fragility and conflict, urban development, and infrastructure planning and finance across a large span of countries. Bala has a master's degree from McGill University in Montreal and a doctorate from Harvard University. So Bala Menon, would you like to come in at this point?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank
Hello,
you.
Can you.
Go ahead.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we can hear you.
First of all, I have an awkward situation here on the ground, and I apologize to you. I couldn't be part of the previous conversation. So I did have a presentation, and which unfortunately I cannot put up on the screen because I'm connected by phone and I'm in a room with several other people. And so there is some constraint in talking also. So some of the sort of structured presentation, and so I'm probably going to miss some of the points that I had in my structured presentation, but I'm going to try and talk through for 5 to 10 minutes, if that's okay with all of you.
Yeah.
Again,
so just to be clear, Bala, did you want us to put up on the screen your presentation? Is that what you said? I just want to be clear.
No. Actually, I'm in a place where I don't have access to the presentation itself, so that I can even share it with you.
Oh, you didn't? Okay,
room,
okay.
In a hospital.
Okay, so go ahead, please. Just do it verbally then. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to make 4 or 5 large points and maybe a set of sub points under each of them. And I do apologize if some of these points have already been raised and discussed by previous speakers, and likely they have been. But I would be very happy to stay on for a little bit more time after this to see how the discussion evolves. So let me start with that by saying that those of us who are probably connected to this have a deep and abiding interest in decentralization in one form or another, either as an academician or as a practitioner or as somebody who is supporting a technocrat who is supporting constituents who are involved in decentralization. So I'm assuming that this is an audience of mixed interest in decentralization. But we do know that the theory says that decentralization ought to be inclusive, accountable, and effective over the longer term, because it reduces information asymmetries between principal and agents, and because it removes distance between public officials and citizens and brings governments closer to citizens. And theory also says that it enhances, and some empirical evidence also suggests that it enhances popular participation, which can lead to increases in democracy, efficiency, equity, etc. We also had, from the World Bank side, the monumental 2004 WDR, Making Services Work for the Poor, which talks about the long and short route of accountability. So there is a long history of theoretical and empirical work on decentralization, which makes the claim of increased accountability, inclusion, and effectiveness. And finally, institutional reforms through decentralization have, at least in certain cases, contributed to greater inclusion of historically excluded minorities, the poor, within the nation state by simply increasing their number in the institutions of local self-government. But in practice, though, the impacts, as we all would most likely agree, of all of these variables are mixed. For example, the expected benefits of reduced information asymmetries have been countervailed by local patronage networks, or any likely allocative or fiscal improvements have been negated by a race to bottom phenomenon among local and regional governments. So these kind of trends, the theory has been superseded by practice, and the empirical evidence on decentralization have been rather mixed in any or all of these areas. And there is a number of studies, starting with the work that looked, for example, at between corruption and decentralization by Vito Tanzi and team some years back. There is also work done by, I think it was by, I forget the name, somebody at Columbia Business School, who looked at the overall impacts of decentralization on service delivery improvements. Again, a very mixed story in terms of improvements in access. There have been sterling successes, but there have also been failures or lack of movement, if you will. So the overall, so the theory is not quite borne out for various reasons and good enough reasons in the field, right? So that is essentially the starting point. So just to bring it to a context in South Asia, I don't know if all of the audience is South Asia, but to bring it to a context in South Asia, which gives a sense of how things have been around the world. The story is not hugely different in other regions if you look over a longer period of time and over a larger set of countries. Of course, some regions have gone ahead more deliberately and have greater success stories. Overall, if you look at the world and divide them up into regions, you will see that the story of South Asia is not different from the story in Africa, not different from the story in East Asia and Latin America, etc. And the story is underlined by maybe 3 or 4 factors. First of all, in South Asia, the trends have been rather idiosyncratic, which is to say that there has been no overarching single trend. Each country has been fashioning its own pathway on decentralization. Second is, it is driven by a combination of factors, among them the global decentralization trends, which have been pushed by agencies like the World Bank at the ground level and the UNDP at the ground level. Then country-specific political changes. We know the case in Nepal, etc. Economic liberalization, which has been a trend since the early 1990s or late 1880s, actually, in the region. Then coming a little later, and somewhat mixed urbanization. So these trends have, these factors have over time sort of combined either by themselves or through a combination with other factors have impacted decentralization in South Asia in countries. And not all of them have been pushing the decentralization agenda forward, and not all of them have supported greater effectiveness, inclusivity, or efficiency in decentralization. But each of these factors, in interplay with other factors, have essentially made the decentralization trends in South Asia somewhat idiosyncratic. Third, of course, is not surprisingly from the above too, that the trajectory has been rather incremental. While there have been cases or periods of big bang, such as in Nepal post-conflict, or in Pakistan after the 18th Amendment, the overall trends of change have been somewhat incremental, with periods of no action and even episodes of setbacks. So all of this underlines in some ways what I started with, to say that decentralization in theory should provide for more allocative, technical, and fiscal efficiencies in certain ways. It should also improve, enhance inclusivity and popular participation. But in practice, empirical evidence suggests that the storyline is somewhat ambiguous and mixed, and that storyline bears truth in South Asia also. Now, if you look at some of the country stories, which is actually much more interesting, the granularity of these country stories are much more interesting. So in Afghanistan, which has been, for example, rather decentralized, for de facto decentralized over its history, years of conflict and fragility of state institutions have essentially constrained the development of a credible intergovernmental system, or the establishment of a local government system that delivers public goods and represents all of its constituents. That's something we know. What I would like to pose a question here is that over the years, over the last 2 decades or 3 decades, the World Bank and all of the international partners have strongly supported a community development program, CDD program, which has been funded by an external large trust fund, which has led to a lot of local level improvements, including in participation, inclusion, delivery of certain services, etc. But my question is, has the establishment of this enormous machinery and this parallel system outside the state, which is in line with the de facto decentralized nature of Afghanistan, but has it really been supportive or detrimental to the development of an intergovernmental architecture, administrative, political, and fiscal architecture, and the strengthening of state institutions? And that's something especially relevant in the context of renewed conflict and fragility in the country, unfortunately. So we need to think, and this is not only in Afghanistan, it's a story we could ask in countries like Indonesia also, which have benefited from large CDD programs. I'm not saying that, I'm not suggesting that these CDD programs are in fact detrimental to localization, but asking the question that, and posing the question that whether what is the interface, for example, between the CDD sort of model in these cases over time versus credible state building, credible intergovernmental fiscal frameworks, etc. That is something we need to think about, and that we need to think about because in entities like the World Bank have been at the front line of supporting this. A lot of development partners also, and it has actually resulted in real improvements on the ground for people. So it's somewhat a policy and a political question that we need to time we need to sort of ask ourselves. Pakistan passed the 18th Amendment of the Constitution, which devolved a significant set of functions to provinces, including, I think, education, environment, local government, rural development, etc. While the larger purpose of the 18th Amendment was to reduce the absolute powers of the presidency, the impacts of devolution itself on quality, efficiency, and effectiveness of service delivery in the above areas like education, health, etc. itself are somewhat mixed and unclear across the country at the macro level and also within provinces over time. It is difficult to isolate specific improvements that can be in these service delivery areas that can be attributed to decentralization itself. So that's my understanding. In India, the 25th anniversary of 73rd and 74th Amendments were fairly recently, about a year or 2 years back. A retrospection will tell us that the overall story is mixed and incomplete at the best. It's a model of partial decentralization. While some states have made progress on, for example, on political decentralization like Kerala, very few states have actually made a consistent and significant effort to devolve functions, finances, and functionaries to the 30th. And very few states have, and very few local governments in very few states have shown the kind of improvements that one would expect of such an effort over the years. And so, in fact, some states may have even regressed over time. Further, the national picture on federalism itself is a struggle of sorts between some centralization tendencies, and an example is GST, which many people support, but from a federalism perspective, it took away the taxing powers from states, and so once you don't have taxing powers, you are removing one of the key instruments of devolution, of successful devolution that provincial and local authorities can employ, and so citizens can use them as a measure to judge their, as a way to judge their performance and reward or punish them, right? So there have been centralization tendencies, and there also a contestation between alternating models of competitive and cooperative federalism in India. Sometimes we hear the voice of competitive cooperative federalism, especially coming from national level. But then on the ground, we have also seen instances of cooperative federalism, especially with competitive federalism, especially with regional parties and regional political forces playing an important role in many states, especially in South and East over the years. This is not to take sheen of several achievements that have come about in the last 25 plus years since the 73rd and 74th Amendments, including in recent years, but simply to highlight that perceived efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability improvements are not straightforward as theory suggests. The real trajectories are much more long-winded, ambiguous, and do require hard-hearted effort, design, and continuous probing to make them deliver on their promise. The two success stories, although for entirely different reasons and whose outcomes are also entirely different, are, in my view, Nepal and Bangladesh. Many of us attending this event will be well aware of the Big Bang and relatively steady progress that Nepal has made on decentralization, with a very strong emphasis on inclusion and effectiveness. This has taken time, and I was lucky to be involved in with other colleagues in the early part of Nepal's federalism movement during the first Constituent Assembly, which didn't actually come up with the constitution, the final draft of the constitution. But this change in Nepal has come essentially because of its own in-country political wins. People like Sardar, Jonas, and many others have been continuing to provide very top-notch technical and other support to the country, which is actually very important because political headwinds are great, but to make sure that decentralization actually works on the ground, that it needs to be backed up with adequate technical improvements, which is what our teams have been doing on the ground. And that has been playing an important role. And I think over years, it is going to sort of further reshape the country political and economic agenda, including on areas like national capital management, local service delivery, inclusion, even furthermore inclusion, stronger inclusion of minorities and ethnic groups, etc. In Bangladesh, it's a very interesting story, something I personally am attached to for a very long time. It started as a technical effort initiated by the bank more than 12 or 13 years back, and that has led to a very significant strengthening, a very notable strengthening of the 4,500 rural local governments, and very important technical improvements to the intergovernmental fiscal framework and systems. It is a work that we can be legitimately proud of, but contrast that with any lack of any national level sort of significant shift towards devolution, etc. So I don't know if Khaled is connected to this program. People like Khaled, Shenwa, Akram, many other colleagues have been continuing to work on this to make this a continued success story. And we have seen actually the level of fiscal decentralization improve very notably, especially to rural local governments. We have seen participation and accountability, including a role of women in local affairs. All of these things improve, enhance quality of local administration significantly. It is not quite translated into urban areas, and Bangladesh is increasingly urban, but I think it will percolate. And because of the nature of Bangladesh state and the political economy there, continued support and managing this process between technical improvements and political sort of nudge are improved. Sort of alternating between them, managing that process very carefully is important, and external partners have an important role, but increasingly the country itself will take a significant role. It is one of those cases where our support has actually led to improvements which have not regressed after we have sort of somewhat stepped back. They have continued to progress, and the political establishment has somewhat been favorable to a limited model of decentralization. Again, it's a model of partial decentralization, not quite devolution, but that is an important one because it's a large country, and because of the nature of the state, it's very important that improvements in the far-flung areas of the country are made. And so it is a case, because of this very unique model, it is a case where we have seen some technical improvements in areas like accountability, representation of important groups, voice, and some improvements in service delivery, etc. So for different reasons, like I say, Nepal and Bangladesh are, in my view, success stories. Finally, we have Sri Lanka, which has an entirely different sort of trajectory, resulting in yet another partial decentralization story. Some of us have been involved from the time of conflict and immediate post-conflict to see what can be done in the north and east. And it started with a very simple local government program. Of course, Sri Lanka, even prior to that, in the late 1980s, had the 13th Amendment, which we probably never wanted, which was forced upon them at that time through geopolitical weakness. But it has taken its roots. It has seen regressions over time during particular phases of government, but has overall withstood the test of time, and has also strengthened the provincial governments, increased their legitimacy overall. And now the trend is increasingly towards the third tier local governments. And it's somewhat a mixed trend. You hear during particular phases of government or political periods, you see an enhanced emphasis on the third tier, on Pradeshi Sabhas, municipal and urban councils. And then you also occasionally then suddenly come to episodes of setbacks where there's a particular law which inhibits local government performance, things like that. But overall, the country has been moving towards at a rather slow pace, but towards decentralization and localization. And I think those trends will continue, especially in the context of the economic trends that might come out of the pandemic, with a focus on things that are much more local, for example, like tourism, regional development, strengthening agriculture extension and creating and expanding agriculture markets. So areas like that, I think, and then of course with technology, I think a different model of decentralization that strengthens the third tier particularly may emerge out of Sri Lanka. This is my take. And that will bring its own set of technical improvements to the system. Whether the fiscal frameworks will adapt to that by design or by accident is something to be seen. We are working very closely with the national government to design an intergovernmental performance and incentive-based transfer as part of the national fiscal transfer regime. And I think that will be interesting. It will be interesting to see how it actually operates on the ground and will bring about any technical improvements to the decentralization of the data. So this is roughly how trends are. And as you can see, to go back, these are somewhat idiosyncratic. They are incremental, and they are driven by a combination of factors that are both in country, but also evolving over time. So finally, I think looking into the future, thinking about what may be some of the major trends that may impact efficiency, accountability, effectiveness, engagement in decentralization, particularly in South Asia. One is definitely urbanization. South Asia has been a laggard in urbanization, but now actually many countries are somewhat urbanized, not through in their official statistics, but if you employ measures like nighttime lights or other agglomeration indicators, you will see that many countries are approaching that 50+% of population in urban areas metric. So urbanization will play a big role in decentralization, especially in the management of services, networked services like solid waste, water supply, drainage, public transport systems, all of these. And people will start demanding as incomes go up, especially in urban areas. My sense is that people will demand better services. Firms will demand better services, and pressures on land and other natural capital endowments will increase. And so this will have to result in some push for strengthening urban local governments, both technically but also politically. And each country will fashion its own path, but urbanization is definitely a trend that will be important in the future of decentralization in South Asia. Second is regionalization, which is somewhat aligned with urbanization, but much bigger than that, within and across countries, especially a focus on lagging states and regions, which is important from a point of view of inclusion, both voice and economic inclusion. And so just like the larger European Union has seen, including the accession countries, have seen a big focus on addressing issues of lagging and leading regions, the disparities that exist between leading and lagging regions. I think this will come to play increasingly in the region and into the development of mega regions. So if you look at the nightlight data in Sri Lanka, for example, you will see a heavy sort of intensity, a concentration of nightlight data from Galle all the way to Kandy, dominated by Colombo. Similarly, if you look at India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc., you will see similar agglomerations that are taking shape, and their impacts on surrounding rural areas, etc., will come and increase in play. And the role of different levels of government in delivering on the promise of regionalization will also be a part of the decentralization story. Finally, again connected, two more things. I think one is the management of land and natural capital endowments. South Asia region is among the most populated regions. It's probably the most populated region, and also very densely populated region. And so there will be a struggle for land and natural capital endowments, which are limited and scarce, which are limited and unevenly distributed, and so there could be very interesting storylines emerging across countries and within countries on how the management of land and natural capital endowments are undertaken. And decentralization will be an important trendsetter in this area. It may very well be incremental with episodes of Big Bang, particularly where contestation, local and regional conflict may emerge. But I think this is where technical improvements are very important, and experience of countries like Indonesia are actually worth taking into account. Indonesia, Brazil, etc., how they have managed natural capital and distributed this are important. I remember a time when we were working on Yemen, where as we were working with the government on delivering on the first constitution, which didn't, of course, happen, post-conflict constitution, the way that dialogue fashioned between regions that had water as a major endowment and the regions that had natural gas as an endowment. So these regions were warring with each other for the longest time, and the fact that they had these two unique endowments, natural capital endowments, which they could use in somewhat interesting ways to trade, actually opened new doors for cooperation. So things like that might emerge in South Asia also. And finally, the continued economic liberalization and its evolution on areas like labor markets, local investments, etc., will continue to fashion decentralization trends, although not in a normative fashion. And so these things, so what I'm trying to draw up here is that these trends will continue. Overall, they will move forward, but there will be periods of setbacks, and the pathways will be idiosyncratic. And so the importance of design, the importance of making sure the means to decentralization are important, as much important as the end itself, as well as the pathways are important, and the means of getting there are important, and the technical improvements are very, very important, in the sense that even during periods of muddling through, technical improvements in areas like inclusion or effectiveness can actually champion the case for further decentralization and for decentralization to be more effective overall. I think this is somewhat this is my reading of what is happening in South Asia overall. And I haven't followed the global trends as closely as I used to do in the past, but my sense is that if you look, let's say, 30 or 50-year history of decentralization across regions and across a panel of countries in these regions, the overall trends may, and including the perceived impact, the perceived versus actual impact on the ground, may very well mirror what is happening in South Asia. Let me stop here. I'm not sure if I've repeated a lot of things from previous presenters because I didn't get a chance to hear. And again, I apologize for this very inconvenient way of presenting these. I did have a presentation, but I hope I've done some justice to the topic. Thank you.